Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It's Friday, September 19th, and what I want to talk about is something that is maybe a little bit unusual. There's so much commentary going on now about, the Charlie Kirk, murder and what's going on in Ukraine and all these and the genocide in Gaza, all of which is important stuff. And there's a lot of very intelligent people who are talking about these topics. But I wanted to talk about something that is a little bit off the beaten track, so to speak, but I still think is very relevant. And that is that when Vladimir Putin, I want to talk about the quality of leadership. I want to talk about what is the character of the people, these leading figures that are making history these days, specifically Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Although Biden is another example. I'm talking about the difference in leadership style, you could say, between the Russian leaders and the people in the United States. And in Europe generally. So Vladimir Putin was giving an interview to Tucker Carlson several months ago, and he said something to me, very interesting and very telling from my own personal development point of view. So recently, President Putin made a reference to Philistines. And he was referring to thinking people, not Philistines, but thinking people, analysts, those who are engaged in real politics, just smart people, using the term Philistines to describe individuals who, in his view, are not engaging in thoughtful or analytical political analysis. This refers back to the German writer Novalis, who disliked materialistic, uneducated people. So when I was in university, I was actually majoring in chemistry at the time, and this was during the Vietnam War. And I had, frankly, a kind of a crisis in the sense that the war was going on. I was watching all of these terrible events happening, basically in my name as an American, and there were things like Agent Orange and napalm and things of that nature. And I just thought, what is going on here? We need to back up and see what is the actual existential situation that humanity is in. Because if we just use technology to solve all our problems without understanding the underlying issues, then there can't be a good outcome. There's a saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, what if they're paved with bad intentions? Which in my observation is what's going on. So Novalis was this guy. He was this was around I think the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he was a young writer, a very young writer who went on a travelogue, did a kind of a travelogue, in which he made a novel out of it, which was in German it was called an Entwicklungsroman, which means a development novel, where someone is, by going on a travel journey, they're kind of exploring the world and seeing what's going on, and also looking inside themselves. This is a very common thing that is well known throughout humanity, where people take pilgrimages, and by traveling, they somehow learn a new aspect of things. Even in Australia, there's something called a walkabout, where a young Australian Aboriginal person would leave his tribe and just walk around for a while. In Thailand, they have something where the monks go on what is called a tudong, where they will literally walk for 30 days, not staying in one place more than one day, just walking. And so it's kind of an experience of self-discovery. So, but Novalis specifically talked about the fact that, in his view, there's like two kinds of people. There's an educated, a cultured type of person who has a thinking type of person, and somebody who is a rather superficial type of person who doesn't really think very much about things and is kind of selfish and I guess you could say shallow. So that brings me in my thought process to a novel that was written by Sinclair Lewis, an American writer, and this is called, in 1922, a satiric novel, Babbitt, which portrays a quintessential American portrait of the Philistine, aligning closely with Novalis' disdain for materialistic mediocrity. The protagonist, George F. Babbitt, is a prosperous real estate broker in a fictional Midwestern city of Zenith, embodying the epitome of middle-class conformity and boosterism. Babbitt's life revolves around superficial successes, closing deals, joining civic clubs like the Boosters Club, and parroting cliched opinions on business, patriotism, and progress without any genuine reflection. He measures worth by material gains, cars, gadgets, social status, while suppressing any inner doubts or artistic impulses, much like Novalis' Philistines, who shunned intellectual curiosity for practical utility. Now, there was another writer that I was involved with in my studies named Hermann Hesse. And in Steppenwolf, this was a novel that was written by Hermann Hesse. The protagonist, Harry Haller, is a tormented individual who feels like a Steppenwolf. So a steppe is like a broad plain, and you hear about the Russian steppes kind of thing, but it's like a prairie, something like that. And a wolf, so he's using the image of a lone outsider, torn between his animalistic instincts and higher aspirations. He despises the Philistine bourgeoisie, whom he sees as complacent swine, content with superficial pleasures like jazz music, cinema, and petty social rituals. These Philistines represent a sanitized, emotionless existence that suppresses the chaotic creative depths of human nature. Haller's hallucinatory journey through the magic theater forces him to confront and integrate his fragmented self, critiquing how Philistinism numbs people to life's complexities. This ties back to Putin's distinction. Haller's thinking side rebels against the Philistine herd mentality, much like Novalis' call for imaginative transcendence over material drudgery. Hesse's novel warns that unchecked Philistinism leads to social decay, where smart people are marginalized while shallow conformists thrive. So what have these tendencies resulted in today? And I would say there's three significant aspects. One is careerism, amorality, and cynical manipulation. So careerism is where you just go along with whatever is the fashionable thing to say, and if that is not working for you personally and you climb up the social ladder, you'll ditch that for whatever's convenient. And this is a very common aspect of many people. They don't really have principles. They just go along with what they think is going to cause short-term success. The other aspect of this is amorality, which means it's related, which means that you don't really have any morals. You're willing to do whatever it takes. It's like he who dies with the best toys wins, and you don't really care how you get there. All it matters is success, is winning. That's all that matters. And that leads to what I call cynical manipulation, which means that you're willing to say anything and manipulate people just to get what you want, and you don't really care. There's no empathy, and people say that empathy is an overworked term, but what it means is being willing to put yourself in another person's shoes and deciding what it's like. So, for example, if you're an Israeli and there's some people living on this area called Gaza, which recently has been called a great real estate bonanza by some Israeli official, you don't care about them. You're willing to just kill them to get rid of them because it's a great real estate opportunity. This is Philistinism to the max that we're talking about. Now, let's compare a national leader, Vladimir Putin, with Donald Trump. And I have a list of differences between these people. I won't go through I won't read the list. You can go read it yourself. But basically, you have an example. Here's Vladimir Putin. He was raised in the city called Leningrad, which has been renamed St. Petersburg nowadays. But he grew up I think he was born in 1952, and his parents lived through the siege of Leningrad during World War II, in which about 1 million people in that city died of either starvation or bombing or disease or something like that, because the Nazis basically did to Leningrad what the Israelis are doing to Gaza right now. They cut off the city, they bombed it, shelled it, forced starvation, and made it almost impossible for the people to survive. They did survive because the Soviet Union at that time was able to manage somehow to get enough supplies through to save the city and to take people out who were desperate to get out. But it was, as I say, the cost was like 1 million people in a city roughly the size of Gaza, actually. So he was raised in this. He was born 3 years after the war ended, and I think his father almost died. I'm sure I forget whether his father or his mother almost died. I think his mother was near death, and his father discovered her near lifeless body, who was on the way to the morgue, and he pulled her out off the bus or something, and then nursed her back to life, and miraculously, she had Vladimir Putin as a baby, after the war. But he actually lost one of his, I think, 2 of his younger brothers. So that was his childhood experience. Now Trump grows up in the home of a wealthy real estate developer, and who did not have a sterling moral reputation, but nevertheless he rose and became fairly, pretty well-known figure, I guess, in New York, the New York real estate scene. And of course, Trump himself, did much of his business was in real estate. Now, in terms of career, Vladimir Putin, he describes it as he grew up during quite a tough time. The streets were mean, he said, after the war, and he was a little bit of a juvenile delinquent, but a little bit. But when he was 12 years old, he started taking Judo lessons, and he said that really turned his life around, because Judo is a martial art, which is very subtle because it makes use of it's a way of thinking about energy and how do you use an opponent's energy against them. But it has it's a very subtle form of martial art. Let's put it that way. But then he went on, and he was very intelligent. He went on. He got a law degree. He got a PhD in economics, which apparently was very important because his training in economics made a big difference in terms of what happened once he became the leader of the Russian Federation. But he also it turns out that after you graduated from university, you get assigned to a job, and he wanted to be part of the KGB, which is the Soviet Union's intelligence service, kind of like the equivalent of the CIA. And in this interview that I saw between Vladimir Putin and Tucker Carlson, they have some screenshots of some scenes from some Soviet movies that talk about the KGB, which is interesting because there's one of these movies is called 17 Moments of Spring, which I've referred to earlier. And that is a movie about a Russian guy, a Soviet guy, who ends up he ends up in the German army, fighting with the Germans, that is on the side of the Germans, but he's actually a mole. He's like deep cover inside of the German military. And he rises through the ranks and eventually becomes a high-ranking officer in the German intelligence service. And he discovers, or he's the Russian High Command discovers that Alan Dulles, who was the head of the intelligence in Switzerland, is having secret talks with a General Wolf, who is an SS officer and a war criminal, and they're negotiating secretly behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt's back. Now, this happens to be a true story. The whole TV series, which is, I think it's like 12 episodes long, it's one of the most popular Russian TV series ever, and I've watched it several times. For me, it's a very interesting drama because it's a spy story, but it's got very, very little violence in it. It's just people talking with each other, and how this guy, he goes about his job, finding out what has to be done and doing it. And this inspired a lot of young Soviet people to join the KGB. And Vladimir Putin was one of them. He then, as an officer there, he then was stationed in Berlin, I think from 1985 to 1990. And as the story goes, when the Soviet Union was in either collapsed or in a state of collapse, or when the I guess the Berlin Wall had come down, a big crowd, of angry Berliners came to the Soviet embassy, and he was there, and he had to meet this angry crowd, which was preparing to storm the embassy, and he had a pistol in his hand, and he said, "Look, this is not your property. This is the property of the Soviet Union. By international law, it is off limits. So I'm here. I've got a gun. Please back off so that I don't have to use it." And the crowd, calmed down, and they went away. So, so that was an interesting aspect of his career. And then, of course, after the Soviet Union fell, and he had a kind of a, what can I say, a disenchantment, I guess you could say, with the communist system, and he became a kind of a low-level bureaucrat. And there's a story about a woman named Sharon. I forget her last name, but she was what's her last name? She was involved in what we call citizen diplomacy, and she had a project to kind of cultivate young capitalists in the post-communist world. And she went to an office of a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg with a friend of hers named Volodya, who I personally know, actually. And so there they are with him, and they present this proposal to him, and he looks at it, and he asks some questions, and then he says, "Well, it's an interesting idea, but according to our current laws, we can't really do this." And Sharon Tennyson, that's her last name, Sharon Tennyson, she was very, very impressed because she assumed that all the Russian officials were now just completely bribable, and he was not bribable. So, and then he ends up, becoming the head of the newly reconstituted Federal Security Bureau, FSB, the successor to the KGB, and then he becomes the assistant to Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Federation during probably the worst time in the post-Soviet period. It was 10 years of gangsterism and complete lawlessness, very dangerous, and the Soviet economy had been decimated. Several million people died of starvation or neglect because of the terrible conditions that happened in this transition, you could say, from communism to a quote-unquote free market economy. But so he becomes the president of the Russian Federation because he was, it appears, and Andrei Matyanov, who was a very interesting guy in the YouTube sphere, and was raised as a Soviet officer and then came to the United States, says that he was probably chosen by the quote-unquote Russian deep state because they knew that Russia had a serious problem, and they thought maybe Vladimir Putin can turn the situation around. So he becomes the president, and at that point he makes a deal with the oligarchs who had stolen hundreds of billions of dollars from the Russian people by these shady deals that sold off the Russian assets to these oligarchs. And he said, look, you've got your money. We're not going to do anything with you unless you get involved in politics. Don't get involved in politics. And so he basically got them to concede that they would not, mess around with the Russian government. And from that point on, Russia basically rebuilt itself to the point where Moscow is one of the safest cities, a clean city, quite elegant actually, and Russia has completely turned itself around since Vladimir Putin became the president. That's the reason why they elect him. It's not because he suppresses. He's not like he's sending people to the gulag. He is got the confidence of the Russian people. Now that does not mean that there are not nefarious individuals like Alexei Navalny, who was trained by the Yale University as an agent to stir up trouble inside of Russia. If you can imagine, if we had a huge scandal because Russia was accused of interfering in the U.S. elections, well, the United States interferes in Russia's elections all the time, but Russia was proven did not do that, and yet when the United States does it, it's perfectly okay. So, but aside from a marginal person like Alexei Navalny, who eventually, his lifestyle and his health habits and so on were not good, and he ended up dying. So that is the career of Vladimir Putin. Then you compare that with Donald Trump, who, I remember early on, there were videos of him bragging about grabbing women by their genitals, ha ha ha, and it's the art of the deal. And when the way you deal with somebody is you basically give them an offer that is so terrible, backed by force, that when you back off and give them something a little bit better, they surrender to you. That's his way of doing business, and also just his personality is extremely different from Vladimir Putin's. So why am I bringing this up? It's because it gets back to this issue of Philistine. What I've done is I've included two long interviews, one with Vladimir Putin that was conducted by Tucker Carlson, and the second was an interview by someone from, I think it's NBC, with Donald Trump. And what I noticed was quite interesting for me personally was I had never seen either of these interviews. I had heard that Tucker Carlson had this very important interview. It got millions and millions of views, and it starts off with Tucker Carlson asking him some question and Putin giving a 30-minute historical introduction to the issue surrounding Ukraine. And people in the United States they shun history. They didn't just think history doesn't really matter. There's an author named Gore Vidal, who actually wrote a book called The United States of Amnesia, because American people think that history doesn't matter. So that's like, you go to the doctor's office, they say, you've got lung cancer. They say, gee, I wonder how that happened. Well, what have you been doing for the last 30 years? Well, I've been smoking 3 packs of Marlboro cigarettes every day. Well, maybe the reason why you got cancer is because you have neglected your health drastically and had bad habits and smoked, and now you're deathly ill. So, does history matter? You damn well better believe it matters. The famous philosopher George Santayana said, those who fail to understand the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. So, but you see, Tucker Carlson is not, he doesn't understand that, and so he thinks that Putin is just, kind of playing with him or something. But eventually he realizes, you can't understand why this terrible problem in Ukraine has arisen until you understand the history of Ukraine. And that is what Vladimir Putin was doing in this interview. And then he went and in the interview he talked tremendously about the background of various aspects of the problem between the United States and Russia. So that was that interview, and I found it quite interesting. Many of the issues that Vladimir Putin talked about, I've been somewhat familiar with. But I thought that was a very, very interesting interview. So then I started watching the interview with Trump, and basically what Trump's interview is about is, I'm great, America's great, everything's great, and it's all about me. I'm wondering, nothing would happen except I am so great. That's basically the lesson that Trump gave. And this is the perfect example of a Babbitt, a Philistine, somebody who really doesn't think, they have no real moral principles. Is Trump willing to take a bribe? Well, he took $100 million from Miriam Adelson in order to close his eyes to the fact that there's genocide going on in Palestine. But, it's all just part of winning. That's all we care about is winning at any cost. And look at the cost. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up is because, leadership matters. The leader of a country sets the tone for that country. And when you had Boris Yeltsin, for example, as the president of Russia after the Soviet Union fell, Vladimir Putin in his discussion with Tucker Carlson was very charitable towards Vladimir Putin, who apparently was alcoholic and was drunk much of the time, and it showed. Then the country was literally falling apart. And then fortunately the people who make decisions about who it's like if you think that any country is chooses its leaders on the basis of just chance or the people or whatever, it's not how it works. Vladimir Putin was chosen because he was recognized as somebody who gave Russia a chance at holding together as a society. That's the issue. And again, when we talk about a society, how does a society function? The thing that really scares me about the United States is that the entire political class are basically populated by Philistines. They really don't care about the people. Even somebody like Bernie Sanders, who purports to be a socialist and talks a good game, never really followed through. He allowed his elections to be stolen from him. He talked about health care, and not a single. The issue of national health care has been on the table since 1948. The United States is the only industrial country that has that does not have a national health care system. And health care is, exorbitantly expensive. And granted, there's Medicare for people who are over 65, but you have to wait for it. And even there, there's a lot of costs that aren't covered. Whereas in other countries, you can go to another country and they pay for your medical expenses. You go to capitalist Russia, and if you're a Russian citizen, you get free health care. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't have its problems, and I have discussed that with my Russian friends and Americans who are friends of mine who also live in Russia, and they have a demographic problem. That is, the birth rate is not as high as it needs to be to keep the population at its current rate, and so slowly the population will go down. But that's true across all of Europe. It's true of Japan, true of China, through much of the world. So that's an issue worldwide. And from what I can see, the only way to turn that situation around is to support families. How do you encourage men and women to get together, have sex, have babies, and then raise them in a loving environment where the kids are well educated, they're happy, they're safe, and they can grow up to be productive, intelligent people. That's how you create a society that works. In our society, it does not work that way. So that's and people can talk about morals, like the Christian Christian right wing, talks about morals, but they're not talking about how do you create a society that actually makes the conditions for a healthy society possible. If you can talk about family values all you want, but if both parents are working, 2 jobs and they're barely able to make ends meet, it's not going to be a good situation. So that's the issue. And why is that? It's because the people at the top set the tone for a society, and the people at the top, particularly in the United States, particularly in Europe, are just they're Philistines. They're thoughtless, self-centered, visionless people, and that is the point that I'm making in this video. So you can read through the material that I have beneath this video and see what you think about it. What I'm trying to do here is to encourage discussion and thinking. My channel is called Inquiry and Thinking. Why? Because if you're going along a programmed track and you're brainwashed and you're just going along that way, the only way to get out of it starts with a question. You have to ask the question: is that really true? Trump is he's a rich real estate kid who was a kind of a hellion himself, but he grew up and he apparently never really outgrew that aspect of himself. So his dietary habits, his the fact that he was hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein, and it's like you have pictures of these two guys who are obviously good buddies, but Trump didn't know anything about what was going on with Jeffrey Epstein. And even though he's taken, 100 million, probably millions and millions of dollars from the Israeli lobby, that doesn't affect his thinking at all. The question of, do the Palestinians deserve a right to live, much less a right to a state, it doesn't occur to him. All Gaza is a real estate opportunity. This is the kind of Philistine, thoughtless, selfish thinking that deeply infects the entire Western civilization. That's the issue. People are not thinking. And so, and I saw this early on in my life. I became a monk because I just said, this is not working. So what I'm trying to do here is to encourage all of you to think and inquire and try and get through the layers and layers of propaganda that you're fed. People have this idea, oh, Vladimir Putin, he's this terrible guy, he's, blah, blah, blah. You just watch him talk with somebody, and then watch Trump talk with somebody, and make your own mind up who is a more thoughtful person. I'm not saying that I agree with Putin on everything, but I'm saying that at least he has a thoughtful attitude. His education was extremely well-rounded. A law degree, an economics degree, and he trained in Judo. So he's like multidisciplinary type of person. What is Trump? He's a game show host and a real estate operator. What was Biden? He was a political hack for 50 years. They called him the senator from MasterCard, because MasterCard was the company in Delaware, and Delaware is like the money laundering corporate capital of the United States, because the regulations governing Delaware corporations are quite lax. And so he was the senator from Delaware, and he's sold out. He sold his whole soul long ago. And before him, Obama. Obama said, "Oh, he's a community activist." But when his pastor started talking about the history of U.S. foreign policy, you're fired. We don't want to hear about that. And then before him was George Bush, who presided over 2 stolen elections, and for him was Bill Clinton, who presided over the destruction of Yugoslavia and expanded NATO in violation of agreements that had been made with the Soviet Union, and George W. Bush, the George Bush the father, and his father was a banker for the Nazis. These are the kinds of leaders that we have running our country, and you probably don't even know this stuff, but it's all documented. So I just try to wake people up here and realize that the fish rots from the head. If you're governed by Philistines, you're going to have a Philistine society. And when I was in business, that's what I saw. They're very. I used to belong to a Rotary Club, and I used to ask questions of the speakers that would come, and people would get angry at me for asking questions that had to do with their welfare. If the electric corporation, the electricity utility in California is building a nuclear power plant on an earthquake fault, and they build it backwards because they screwed up with their blueprints, and I raised the question in public. They get angry at me for asking the question. This is Philistinism. So I think I've kind of ranted enough here, but I hope you get the point that we really need to change the nature of the political, and it really starts with the intellectual and spiritual culture of the country. That's what it revolves around. People need to be more introspective, more critical thinking, and have more empathy for other people. And that's the only way we're going to get out of it. And frankly, I don't think that there is a way out of it, because these habits are so deeply ingrained that it's going to take a real shock for people to wake up and realize what the problem is. So that's what I got to say. So please, support my channel, share it as much as you can, and if you have a chance to, send a little money my way, that'll help me pay the bills. That will be very helpful. You can send it to PayPal, or buy me a coffee, or to sign up for a subscription with Substack. So or buy a T-shirt. My information, billboard T-shirts, which are not touting me personally. They're basically trying to just get a message out that will help people think. So that's what I've got to say here, and thanks again for listening, and I'll talk with you soon.